What does it actually mean to heal? Is it just fixing the physical stuff, or, does it go way deeper? Welcome to This Explainer, future counselors. Today, we're completely shifting our lens on disability. We're moving away from that purely medical framework and diving into the deeply emotional and relational side of things. As you prep to support folks through some of life's messiest transitions, this is a population you are absolutely going to encounter, no matter your clinical specialty.
We're talking about an experience that frankly gets overlooked way too often in our field, even though it directly impacts 1 in 5 individuals in the U.S. living with a disability. I mean, 1 in 5. That is a huge portion of the population. But despite that, the emotional roller coaster of acquiring or living with a disability is constantly missed. Even the most well-meaning pros get so laser-focused on the physical symptoms that they completely miss the hidden, silent journey of grief and loss sitting right there in front of them. Understanding this is absolutely critical if we actually want to be effective practitioners.
So, here's our game plan for this explainer. We'll start with the foundations of effective counseling, redefine what grief and loss actually look like here, break down the 4 dimensions of loss, figure out exactly why this grief goes unseen, and finally, define what our true role as counselors really is.
All right, let's jump right into part 1, the foundations of effective counseling. Before we even get to the grief part, we have to talk about the absolute strongest predictor of whether counseling actually works, and research backs this up time and time again. It's the therapeutic alliance. Honestly, it's way more important than whatever specific technique or worksheet you happen to memorize in grad school. Think about it. If you've got a client navigating the raw trauma of a newly acquired disability, they are not going to respond to some textbook intervention if they don't feel a genuine human connection with you first. This collaborative relationship is literally the engine that makes all other clinical work possible.
And what is that alliance actually built on? Well, it takes trust, safety, empathy, mutual respect, and, this is a big one, unconditional positive regard. What does that actually look like when you're sitting in the room? It means when a client unloads pure anger about their physical limitations or just deep sorrow about how incredibly unfair their situation is, we don't judge. We don't try to slap a toxic positivity spin on it. We create a rock-solid, non-judgmental space so they feel safe enough to be seen in their darkest moments. Building on that, we have got to embrace cultural humility. This means constantly checking our own power dynamics and staying wide open to the client's reality without projecting our own stuff onto them. It is so easy to fall into clinical assumptions, like you might assume an amputee sitting across from you is strictly grieving the physical loss of their limb. But actually, if you ask with humility, you might find out they're really grieving the loss of their identity as a marathon runner. Cultural humility is all about asking, not assuming. It's a lifelong habit of being truly other-oriented. Okay, moving on to section 2. Let's completely redefine grief and loss. We really need to ditch the idea that disability is just a medical condition that needs to be treated or fixed. We have to contrast our approach with the traditional medical model of care. Look, doctors treat the physical body and handle rehabilitation, but as counselors, our job is to treat the lived reality. Disability is a massive social, emotional, and relational experience. It fundamentally shapes a person's identity and dictates how they navigate a daily world that, let's be honest, usually wasn't built for them.
So here's the kicker. Grief isn't just about bereavement or death. I know that's where most people's minds go when they hear the word. But grief is actually the broader emotional response to any significant disruption or change in life. And for folks with disabilities, this grief is ongoing and heavily layered. For someone with a chronic or progressive condition, grief isn't a one-and-done event they just process and get over. It's super cyclical. Every single time they lose a new function or hit a new societal roadblock, that grief flares right back up.
Which brings us to section 3, where we unpack the 4 distinct dimensions of this loss. First up is the loss of function. This is a monumental life shift. It's grieving diminished bodily autonomy, or suddenly not being able to do everyday things. Let's ground this in reality for a second. What does losing bodily autonomy actually feel like? On a random Tuesday morning, when you're literally just trying to make breakfast. Think about the frustration, the vulnerability of needing help for something so incredibly simple, the sheer exhaustion of your morning routine taking 3 times as long. That loss of function turns day-to-day independence completely upside down.
And naturally, when you lose function, you often lose a piece of how you define yourself. So the second dimension is the profound loss of identity. Our sense of self is so wrapped up in our abilities, our roles, our dreams. When a disability shifts all that, a person mourns their old goals and the future they had mapped out. This grief for an unlived future is a massive clinical insight.
They aren't just grieving who they used to be. They are grieving the entire life trajectory they expected to have. Third, we hit social loss. This is the painful realization that they might not be able to work, drive, or engage in family dynamics the exact same way they used to. Just think about the family ecosystem for a second. If the primary breadwinner or the main caregiver suddenly becomes the one needing care, everything is disrupted. Roles flip, tensions spike, and it can lead to this incredibly isolating sense of social disconnection right inside their own home.
The fourth dimension is ambiguous loss. We see this a lot with traumatic brain injuries, dementia, or progressive neurological conditions. The grief here is terribly messy and unresolved. The person is physically right there, sitting across the dinner table, but they are fundamentally changed on a psychological, emotional, or functional level. It creates this wildly confusing, guilt-inducing grief for everyone involved. Because, how do you mourn someone who is still physically right in front of you?
Just imagine a young adult who recently acquired a physical disability after an accident. They're mourning their lost independence, their future plans, their old routines. But meanwhile, their family, their doctors, and society at large are unintentionally minimizing all that emotional trauma by obsessing over physical rehab. Everyone's telling them to stay strong and push through, while the emotional toll gets completely shoved to the sidelines.
So why does this happen? Let's get into Section 4 and explore exactly why this grief goes unseen.
There are two massive barriers blocking validation here. First, disenfranchised grief. This happens when society just outright refuses to validate the person's loss, usually relying on harmful assumptions that minimize what they're going through emotionally. Then, on the flip side, we have diagnostic overshadowing. This is a huge clinical failure where we, as healthcare pros, wrongly blame a client's sadness, anxiety, or withdrawal entirely on the disability itself. We literally miss the forest for the trees. For example, if a client with a recent spinal cord injury gets super lethargic and withdrawn, a poorly trained doctor might just shrug and say, well, that's just the physical manifestation of the injury. But a good counselor, they'll look closer and realize, no, this is clinical depression driven by unvalidated grief. Diagnostic overshadowing completely blinds us to the client's actual psychological state.
And these barriers get so much worse when you factor in cumulative loss. This is when a cascading series of changes just piles up over time. Picture this. Losing a supportive caregiver means you suddenly lose your home because you can't live independently anymore. Losing your home means losing your daily routine and your neighborhood support system. These losses don't just happen in a vacuum, they compound over months and years. It creates this profound, heavy exhaustion that severely impacts emotional well-being. It makes intervention tough, for sure, but absolutely crucial.
Which leads us perfectly into our final section, the counselor's true role.
Look, as counselors, our job is absolutely not to fix their grief. We can't rush them through healing. You simply cannot fix a profound life transition. It doesn't work like that. Instead, our role is to recognize that hidden loss and create a safe, fiercely validating space where they feel deeply, truly heard. The medical doctors are there to fix the body. We are there to hold space for the mind.
Doing this demands pure presence. It means firing up those active listening skills and actually tuning into the emotions buried underneath the words. It means showing genuine empathy. This right here is how you take all those theories we talked about and put them into practice. This is what the therapeutic alliance and cultural humility actually look like in the real world. You sit with them in the mess and the discomfort, making sure they are seen as complex human beings, not just a diagnosis on a chart, because a disability does not in any way diminish a person's emotional reality.
I want to leave you with one final thought as you head into your clinical practice. When you have the absolute privilege of sitting across from someone navigating these massive life shifts, when that client walks into your office, will you truly see the individual and their unique, unseen journey beyond the disability?